The Korean War lasted from 1950 to 1953 and ended in a stalemate, where North and South Korea are still divided to this day as of 2024. That's pretty common knowledge. Also, the Korean War is famous for almost escalating to the point of the use of nuclear weapons following the Chinese intervention into the war against the United Nations and South Korean forces. Times that nukes were considered were on July 9, 1950, when General Omar Bradley raised the possibility during a Joint Chiefs of Staff meeting. Then on July 13th, when Major General Bolte proposed sending nuclear weapons into Korea. Then on November 30th, 1950, President Truman was asked several times during a press meeting about the use of atomic weapons and stated that the use of nuclear weapons was always being considered depending on communist China, but that he hoped that they would not be used. Then, of course, there's the most famous one, which was in 1951 when MacArthur was wanting to nuke various targets in China. And lastly, there was one in 1953 when President Eisenhower threatened to drop the bomb on China if they didn't come to the negotiating table to end the war. Now, you might be wondering why the use of nuclear weapons was even on the table to begin with during the Korean War. Well, first of all, there was no mutually assured destruction between the United States and Soviet Union during the course of the war, as although the Soviets had successfully tested a nuclear bomb in 1949, Soviet thermonuclear weapons were successfully tested in 1953, and ICBMs would then become a large priority. The military logic for the use of nuclear weapons was to prevent further loss of life on both sides and end the conflict by dropping one or multiple atomic bombs that would end the war a whole lot sooner than it did. To understand the use of nuclear weapons, you have to know the mindset of those who considered using nukes at the time. For example, Douglas MacArthur was not a nuclear madman and saw nuclear weapons in 1951 as a tool to end the war in one bombing instead of prolonging a conventional war. Similarly, Eisenhower threatened a nuclear strike to bring China to the negotiating table to end the war in a ceasefire. But what if, in an alternate timeline, the United States did use nuclear weapons in the Korean War? When nukes are used will be very important, as 1950, 1951, and 1953 all had very different conditions within the Korean War. For example, in July of 1950, the U.S. had not conducted the Incheon landings and was kind of barely holding onto the Pusan perimeter. Meanwhile, in 1951, China had fully intervened and invaded South Korea, taking the Korean capital of Seoul once again. In 1953, the war had dragged on into a stalemate similar to the conditions of World War I, with Chinese human wave attacks and slugfests for trying to take mountains. Nuclear weapons would have only been used in 1950 had the Incheon landings been a failure, and even then, using nukes would be a stretch. The only realistic time that the US would use atomic weapons in the Korean War would have been in 1951 after the Chinese intervention. MacArthur had wanted to use 50 nukes in military targets over the Yalu River in China, and I do not think that Truman would be approving the use of 50 atomic bombs, and would probably approve less than 10. You see, B-29s are going to have to make the trek into Chinese and North Korean territories, and there's a pretty likely chance that if only one nuke had been sent, then it would be shot down. So probably 5 are sent in and a few hit their targets. The effects in Korea would obviously be a South Korean and UN victory, but the US had heavily escalated a small conflict. MacArthur felt that the Soviets and Chinese would be so shocked from the use of nuclear bombs in the Korean War that they would fully withdraw and give up to the United Nations. Again, he saw the atomic weapons as a tactical tool to end the war. Additionally, people in the early 1950s didn't view the atomic bomb the same way that they would in the late 1950s, as nuclear weapons became even more advanced. Global reactions to the American use of nuclear weapons in Korea would definitely be shock. Nobody on either side actually thought that the United States would actually use nukes in what would be considered a small conflict in Korea. The Soviets would undoubtedly go nuts and immediately pull all resources towards their nuclear program, as since the US dropped the bomb in Korea, the Soviets can only wonder what the US would do to them in a minor conflict. The UN would also be pretty shocked and probably fear unnecessary American escalation in future conflicts. Mutually assured destruction would come onto the global stage, and things would be even more tense than they were in our timeline, as the US had normalized atomic bombings and proxy wars. With that in mind, I could see 2 different results. One being that neither side uses nukes out of fear of MAD since the Korean War. The other result would see the US and Soviets use nukes in proxy wars and heavy nuclear escalation between the two factions that might eventually lead to World War III. However, there is one major positive aspect to the US use of nuclear weapons in the Korean War to end the conflict. The war ends 2 years sooner, and North Korea no longer exists, so that's a good thing. That is all just one possible scenario about if nuclear weapons were used in the Korean War. What do you think would have happened? Write in the comments, and thank you for watching.